The important thing to recognize here is that the military-industrial complex and the wars that we constantly see, and these are wars waged overwhelmingly by the core economies, right? By the wealthy economies. Why is that? Like, why is it these apparently liberal democracies of the West are such incredibly violent warmongers? I mean, routinely conducting coups and assassinations in global South countries, violating the sovereignty of other countries, completely like bombing them to smithereens. We saw this with, in my lifetime alone, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, what they clearly want to do to Iran, the warmongering against China. Like, what is going on here? And these are the so-called liberal democracies. It's actually crazy that we have this in our mind, that these are somehow these are the civilized countries, So the reason this occurs, of course, is precisely because of capitalism. And this has been true for the past 500 years of capitalist history. Capitalism requires an imperial arrangement as a fundamental condition for its existence. The key element of capital accumulation is that you need cheap labor and cheap nature. Now, you can do that domestically in your own economy only to a certain extent, cheapening your working classes and exploiting your ecological base until you face contradictions, like you're going to have a revolution or your ecological base will become degraded and you won't be able to produce anymore. And so capital has to resolve this problem by finding an outside, an external frontier from where to appropriate cheap nature and cheap labor in abundance. And that is where colonialism came in. And so the colonies were organized around being suppliers of cheap nature and cheap labor. These are terms used by Jason Moore, the political ecologist Jason Moore.
When you say cheap nature, you mean like raw materials?
Yeah, basically raw materials. And by cheap, I mean like you can extract them with impunity. Like you don't worry about regulations. You don't worry about dispossessing the people who depend on them for their lives. You don't worry about the wages that must be paid to them. In lots of cases, this was done like through outright enslavement of people, dispossession of people, etc. That's what makes nature cheap, right? And so there was a massive appropriation of nature and labor from the global South. And we live now in a apparently post-colonial era, but in reality, the same mechanisms are at play. And we can see this empirically, where growth in the core capitalist economies, Western Europe, the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, we know empirically that growth and consumption in these countries depends on a massive appropriation of labor and nature from the global South. And we've shown this in several papers now using models of the world economy. And it's actually staggering. And so in order to maintain that flow of wealth from south to north, they have to prevent the global South from achieving sovereign developments, right? And this is the reason for the wars that continually are imposed on the global South. Any country that starts to achieve sovereign developments, like organizing their own resources and production around the national development needs of their own population, gets attacked. And the reason is because when global South countries do that, it's good for the global South, for the workers and the people of the South, but it's inflationary for capital in the core because it increases the input price and makes profit maximization more difficult to achieve. And so what they want to do is they want to bomb those countries, destroy their development infrastructure, and make them cheap once again. This is crucial for the continuation of capital accumulation and is the main cause of imperialist wars. And so if we want to see an end to imperialist wars, we have to overcome capitalism.
So you're saying that when the U.S. goes in and bombs a global South country, it's not to defend women's rights?
It is definitely not to defend women's rights.
Because that's what I hear on the news and back home.
Which is so funny because if you think about like the U.S. and the idea that it's for democracy or something like that.
Yeah.
Like the U.S. props up dictatorships around the world. They regularly depose democratically elected leaders and replace them with dictatorships, including ones that are very regressive and oppress women. I mean, if you think about like, just look at Saudi Arabia. I mean, a core Western ally has a terrible record on women's rights, obviously, and yet you never hear a peep about that,
Right.
So
we're not going to liberate the women of Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. There's nobody in the U.S. power class that wants to do that.
Because they serve our economic interests. So ultimately, it does come down to, there is this like really strong link between the economic model and imperialism.
Absolutely.
And so would you say it kind of comes down to the people in all of the countries, right? It's not up to the global north to solve all of these problems. But ultimately, if the root of the problem is imperialism, then it is actually essential that the governments of the imperialist countries are taken over by the people and decisions start to get made in a more humane way that delivers not just justice and better lives for people in those countries, but ultimately that'll have a spillover effect into the global south.
Totally. This is crucial, right? If you're a person that does not want to see bombing and genocide and literal slave labor, which is right now occurring in the Congo, which is crucial to the supply chains that make our technologies possible, right? I mean, the kind of exploitation that we're talking about that occurs in the global south to feed capitalist supply chains in the global north is unspeakable. And if this is concerning to anybody, then the solution is clearly a post-capitalist transformation. But here's the important point, is that the real agent of world historical transformation here is also going to be global south struggles for independence, for sovereignty. The states in the global south that want to break free from the imperialist arrangements and reclaim control over their own productive capacities and organize them around human needs and well-being and national development, like we're seeing in the Sahel countries, for example, right now, or like China, like the revolution in China that occurred in the 1950s, in the 1940s. By the way, the USA has never forgiven them for having that revolution and kicking the imperialists out. Over and over again, the anti-colonial movement has achieved these objectives, and the immediate response from the West is to topple their governments and intervene militarily or through rigging elections, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. has conducted dozens of regime change operations in the global south in this way. But what's crucial here is that this shows you where the sensitive point is in the capitalist world economy. When the global south pursues liberation struggle, this destabilizes capitalism, and the global north countries face a choice. Either they can accept decolonization and shift to a post-capitalist economy, right? Or they can choose to maintain capital accumulation by reimposing the imperial arrangement in some violent kind of way. And so, and this shows you that the crucial role that can be played by people in the global north is that when this crisis comes, which it came in the 1970s and is going to come again, is maybe we're even in that moment right now, where capital accumulation has difficulty because of liberation struggles in the global south and wants to react with war, there's an alternative. We have to make that alternative available, and that alternative is to shift to a post-capitalist economy that does not require an imperial arrangement. This is crucial. An economy, a functioning economy, does not require imperialism. A capitalist economy does. And so we can shift to a post-capitalist economy that does not require that kind of violence. But we have to have the organizations, the ideas, the political infrastructure in place to make that a reality.
Right. It makes me think about the situation in Palestine now and the recent escalation of the situation into Iran. Do you see the occupation of Palestine as a result of capitalist imperialism?
I think there's an absolutely crucial connection there. Yeah. I think we have to understand that, like why does the U.S. support this genocidal regime, Israel, right? It's strange because it's deeply unpopular in the U.S. People want to see the genocide stop. They recognize that Israel is being extremely destructive, committing war crimes, violating international law, etc. Why would the U.S. continue to support this system to the point of debasing their own apparent values so publicly, right? And the reason is because the U.S. sees Israel as crucial to the interests of the capitalist class. Now, let me explain exactly what's going on here. The U.S. started supporting Israel in the 1960s, right? Now, why was that? Is because across the Middle East and North Africa, there was a movement called Pan-Arabism and also Pan-Africanism and Arab socialism and African socialism, which were inspiring the masses in these regions. And the U.S. knew, if you're looking at the Middle East and North Africa, which they consider to be the linchpin of the world, right? Think about it. Like, this is at the center point of Asia, Africa, and Europe. An area like this going independent and having control over their own resources is deeply threatening to the possibility of
existential threat.
Existential threat, totally. And so they knew they needed some way of destabilizing these movements, and they used Israel to do that. So Israel became kind of the attack dog of the United States. They armed it to the teeth. They directly used Israel to destabilize the more radical movements in the Middle East, the socialist movements in the Middle East, other progressive forces. They used Israel to bomb countries, assassinate leaders, destroy progressive political associations, et cetera, et cetera. Israel became extremely useful for them in this regard. And that's why it's effectively a U.S. military base in the region. It's like, it's their bridgehead to maintaining control and ensuring the prevention of development in that region. I'm talking about independent development, right?
Right.
Not like Saudi Arabia's development, which is totally like aligned with U.S. interests.
Funded in many ways by the
It's
US.
effectively a client state of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm talking about what they want to avoid is independent development. And the reason they routinely want to bomb countries in the Middle East and North Africa is to achieve that. That's why they got rid of Libya, Iraq, Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So, and Israel's instrumental for doing that. It's effectively a projection of U.S. power in that region.
It's not just about having a military presence in an oil-rich area, which it is about that, but it's actually fundamental to the operation of this imperialist capitalist economic model that's global and runs much deeper than just the oil trade.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you think about it, like, because these ideas are popular, right? In the 60s and 70s, national liberation ideas and socialist ideas were extremely popular across the global south. Look at Asia. I mean, extraordinary popularity of socialist struggles there. And the U.S. knew they had to be intervening to destroy that. And that's why, of course, they did the Vietnam War. It's not just about any particular resource. It's about we have to dismantle the very possibility of these popular socialist movements ever winning the hearts and minds of people, which they automatically do, right? And so they have to be violently crushed. And that's what this is effectively the bread and butter of U.S. foreign policy, to the point where it's absolutely insane. Like, Vietnamese peasants would like to control their own land and produce for their own well-being. And the U.S. is just like, you know what? We're going to have to completely destroy your country with napalm and firebombing because that is not an acceptable idea. Freedom is not an acceptable idea. This is what we're dealing with. And so it's not necessarily like the U.S. desperately needs Gaza to be obliterated, but rather they cannot stomach the possibility of a liberated Palestine because this might lead to liberation movements elsewhere in the region. And that becomes very destabilizing for the U.S. for capital accumulation. And so if we want to avoid being in a situation where it is somehow rational for our leaders to be conducting a genocide, then we have to overcome this particular economic system.
Something I love that you do with your social media platforms is highlight other historical figures from the kind of anti-imperialist historical movement of the last couple of centuries. If there were 2 or 3 other historical figures that you would want listeners of this podcast to go look into and learn more about, who would they be?
So I'm going to go with, there's so many.
Way more than 2 or 3, of course.
I try to keep them in our minds as much as possible because they're so inspiring and they can show us the way. I'll just name the first person I would say is Thomas Sankara. He was the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s. An extraordinary story. One of the things he realized is that the debt was being used as an instrument of imperial control in the global south. And so he called for collective debt cancellation in the global south, especially in Africa, as a liberatory move. And this
I
idea
can imagine
was,
some people who would be unhappy with
there
that.
were people who were unhappy. And in fact, it's interesting because he actually raised this issue in the African Union when he was giving a speech to his fellow heads of state. And he was like, look, if Burkina Faso, escapes the debt on its own, then I won't be here next year to speak to you. He knew that his life was on the line. But he said, if we do it together, there's no way they can kill us all. Well, 3 months later, Thomas Sankara was assassinated in a French-backed coup and replaced with a brutal dictator who governed the country for several decades after as a stooge of the West. This is, I think, an amazing example of exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about. But one of the things that Sankara said is he said, we are the heirs of the world's revolutions. We are the heirs of the world's revolutions. I love this saying because it reminds us that every good thing that we do have, like what few democratic rights we do have, what few equalities we do have, etc., were won through struggle, through class struggle, through anti-colonial struggle, through feminist struggle, etc. And we benefit from our ancestors' struggles. And this should inspire us to take similar action in our world today. For a second person, just to be timely, I think, would be Mohammad Mossadegh. He was the first independent prime minister of Iran. And he was a progressive figure, beloved by his people, very popular in Iran. And he was making very modest moves to improve the conditions of the working class and to regain national control over Iran's oil reserves. And this pissed off the US and the UK, who then collaborated in deposing him in a coup and replacing him with, again, a dictator, the Shah of Iran, who then governed the country as a brutal enforcer of dictatorial principles for the next several decades. So again, an example. And if anyone wants to know why Iran does not trust the United States, that is the reason. That is the reason. It was the original sin of the relationship between Iran and the West, and has never been like properly repaired for or acknowledged.